Hello, everyone. Welcome to I believe this is the 13th webinar that we've given for the Earth Regenerator study group. I'm really excited to see you all today, and I appreciate how many of you are already introducing yourselves and saying hello in the chat box. If you haven't done so yet, please fill out the poll that I posted. You can see there's a poll at the bottom of the screen. I'd love to just get a feel of how your emotions are as we're starting the conversation today, because there sure is a lot going on in the world. And today we're going to be talking about how we could design a school or a research center, a place of gathering and learning and practice for Earth regeneration. And I think this is something that is going to be very emotional for us on many fronts. It'll require us to confront some very disturbing realities of the world, some excitement and feelings of empowerment, solace and peace, feelings of connection with others, a lot of things that come together. And I really want to just share with you that this is really an important topic. And so I'm really glad you're here. And I'm just delighted to be in the conversation with all of you. Today, we're going to be following the same format that we do every time, which is that I will give a brief presentation for about 30 minutes to help frame the context of our discussion. And then we'll have an extended period of time for about between 1 hour and 90 minutes additionally. So we usually do use the full 2 hours, and we probably will again today, where we can invite everyone who would like to ask questions using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll use those questions for our discussions. And I also encourage you, as always, to have conversations in the chat box on the side, where we always have wonderful conversations that are going on. I even see a friend here in Barichara, Jup is here, so I have some local friends here and local friends from North America, where we used to live. So it's lovely to see you all here. I also want to say that the conversation today, for me, is something of a preparatory step for making transitions with the study group. As many of you probably know, we are now at the point where our study group has grown to more than 1,700 members. We're beginning the process of training a group of facilitators to help organize and manage the study group as it becomes whatever it becomes next, as a network of working groups, so that we can really focus on building capacity in each bioregion where people want to do their own local work. And at the same time, my family is getting deeply interwoven into activities here that really create quite a lot of potency for regeneration where we live in Barichara in Colombia. And so with that said, I see this topic today of a design school for Earth regeneration having a blend of an online community that we've already been building, as well as a physical location, or maybe a network of learning centers that grow into this capacity together. So I also see a few people are expressing concerns about my internet connection in the chat box. I just want to say that one of the benefits of being semi off the grid is that we actually are glad to have a weaker connection to the globalized system and have some separation. And so that does create technical challenges from time to time, but we consider those just part of the balanced life that we've chosen to live by being out in the mountains and away from a big city. So I'm about to start the presentation portion of our discussion today. And what I'd love to do is invite you during the presentation at any time to go to the Ask a Question button that's at the bottom of the screen and pose any questions that you have. After the presentation portion is over, I will invite those who have the questions that get the most votes. So you can also vote for other questions if you'd like to have answered. And I will invite the people who ask those questions into a shared dialogue where we can invite them into a video, like a split screen video conversation, and have some interaction and dialogue. So there will be opportunity to come on the screen and talk and share your ideas as well. Alan, it's okay. Thank you for expressing your desire for better connectivity. It is much appreciated. So yeah, with that in mind, I can see from looking at the poll that a lot of people are excited and ready to go. A few people are expressing that it's their curiosity that's driving them at this point in time. Several people are choosing not to choose by having multiple feelings at the same time. And at least one person is feeling a little tired and overwhelmed. And so I just want to say that you are held, that a lot of us are probably feeling tired and stressed at different moments throughout everything that's going on. So it's very good to have you all here. And thank you for expressing your feelings honestly in this poll. So what I hope to do today is share with you a vision that I've had for a while about how to create a design school appropriate for these times. And my hope is that this will be something that we can co-create together, and we can find a lot of ways to do that. That creates pathways of empowerment and healing for a lot of people. So don't think of this only as Joe's idea, although a lot of these are ideas I've been holding for some time, but instead feel into how does this conversation relate to your life and where you want to go in your life, so that we can try to create all of this together. So with that in mind, let's get started. I will go into screen sharing mode, and then I'll start the presentation portion. And as a reminder, please use the Ask a Question button to help you or to pose any questions during the presentation, and vote for the questions you want answered, and we'll use those to organize our discussion later. So the topic today is creating a design school for Earth regeneration. And we're talking about this at all levels, as we have done throughout the last half year in the study group. Earth regeneration is a nested set of challenges that go as local as your backyard and as large as planetary. And we're going to try to hold that immense complexity in mind as we ask, what would it mean to design a pathway for Earth regeneration? And where would we go to learn how to do this? So before we get into that vision of a design school, I want to share with you something personal in my life. Shortly after our daughter Elise was born, here's a picture of her when she's 1 day old. So I'm a new father in this photo. Shortly after she was born, I fell into a pretty deep depression that lasted for about a year. And this culminated in writing an essay that was titled, "Why I No Longer Attempt to Build a Rigorous Science of Social Change," that was published in June of 2018, so about 2 years ago. Now, when I wrote this essay, I basically made a public declaration that I was giving up on my life's work, and I had declared it to be a failure. I had spent about 20 years trying to develop a design science for large-scale social change, collaborating with a lot of other people. And this essay outlined my reasons for believing that that was no longer possible. And amazingly, by letting go of this large, ambitious vision and starting to focus inward on being a father and having a healthy relationship in our family, and then therefore asking, how could we live regeneratively? It was only after letting go and giving up on that previous work that I began to really find my way. Shortly after this, my wife and I moved to Costa Rica and then later to Colombia. So we've been on this deep journey of transformation that was built around a desire to create a design science. And then later, what we have today is, I think, a much better vision than anything I could have articulated before I gave up. And so there's something really important about this grieving process, this letting go, the spiritual journey that is a key part of becoming an Earth regenerator. That is definitely true in my life, and I suspect it's true for a lot of you too. So here's the heavy hit. When I talk about Earth regeneration, I am talking about this with eyes wide open about the seriousness of our planetary predicament. As the human population overshoots and collapses in the next few decades, every unsustainable culture will do what unsustainable cultures do. It will die. It will collapse. It will go away. just like the Roman Empire, just like the Aztecs, just like the Incas, just like so many civilizations and empires that came before. They will become compost for the Earth's biosphere. The way that I like to frame the mission of this design school is that we're trying to avoid human extinction. So as this large pulse of human population goes through overshoot and collapse, what we want to do is grow and stabilize a community of Earth regenerators all over the planet who are able to hold regenerative projects on the land in different places, keeping humans from going extinct and helping us to build regenerative economic systems that survive and that come to thrive as the unsustainable cultures die away around us. And I see this as being the mission of this design school as I understand it. Now, you might have a slightly different vision, and that's something we can discuss during the discussion portion of today's conversation. I want to really emphasize that for me, this is the bleak and serious context in which I see this design work being necessary. Now, we actually have a lot to work with, even in such a difficult situation. We have the scaffolding of a curriculum. Many of you have probably read the entire book that I wrote, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. All 26 chapters are offered freely on the website of the Earth Regenerators study group. I wrote this book as, in part, to try to create a structure of learning, a set of topics and themes, a set of frameworks and tools that could be used for Earth regeneration. And so we have this book as a set of ideas that have been combined and made easily accessible. And as of right now, we have more than 1,700 members in our study group. So we have quite a lot of capacity among us to build a proper design school with many different elements built by many different people. And so we're entering into this conversation with quite a lot of preparation. Those of you who saw my previous webinar about regenerating an entire continent will recognize this picture. One way to think about this design school is that we would organize a lot of our work around creating bioregional scale economies, organizing regenerative projects around watersheds, mountain ranges, coastal estuaries, and so forth. And then build networks of these bioregional projects that span entire continents. So in South America, the natural organizing structures are the Andes mountain range and the Amazon basin. And every continent has its own landscape organizing patterns that we can do our regenerative work around. So this design school would need to organize itself around the nested scales of complexity from local to continental in this way. And if we do this, then we can create bioregional networks on every continent. So part of the work of this design school is to hold the complexity of the entire planet, to ask essential, difficult questions about how to regenerate entire continents, and then organize and cultivate very practical skills and institutional capacities for local regeneration efforts. So this is an incredibly complex set of challenges that we need to face. And amazingly, there does not exist a design school on Earth that is trying to do all of this. There are a lot of places, and I could name a few examples. Let me give you two. There are a lot of places that do pieces of this. One example is more formal and traditional, and that's Columbia University, which has an Earth System Science Research Center that combines the science of Earth systems with economics and social modeling, trying to do work on sustainable development. But there are also alternative schools like Schumacher College that have been teaching holistic design, transdisciplinary science, indigenous worldviews, and permaculture. So there are different kinds of schools with different capacities doing pieces of this. But isn't it amazing that here we are in July of 2020, and we don't yet have a design school that is trying to regenerate the Earth across all of these scales in a systematic fashion? It is time to create this school right now. Another thing I want to say is there's an insight from how evolution works that can really inform our thinking. And it works like this. evolution needs to be understood as the statistical properties of populations. You might have a population of rabbits. Some of them have darker fur, some of them have lighter fur. So you have different individuals within a population that have different traits. And as an environment changes, some of those traits are more adaptive to the future environment than others. So you end up with a higher percentage of them in the future. This is how natural selection works in biology. When we apply this to culture, we can think in this way, that we're going to have a human population explosion followed by a rapid die-off, an overshoot and collapse pattern. Right now, we have a mixture of regenerative cultures and extractive cultures. All of the extractive cultures are unsustainable. So as we pass through this evolutionary bottleneck, our job is to create as many regenerative cultures as we can so that we have stacked the deck for the future. Some of these regenerative cultures will not survive the transition. Those that do are going to be the future seeds of culture for humanity that comes after this period of transformation. So our job is to create a network of regenerative cultures and make them as resilient as possible to massive scale disruptions for a period of 50 to 100 years. And this has got a whole set of design challenges that we need to deal with if we're going to have a design school for Earth regeneration. Another thing I want to say is that we have some really beautiful historical examples, such as how there have been monasteries of different kinds that were the wisdom holders during the Dark Ages. So there are monasteries and Buddhist temples and places like this, Taoist temples in the Far East, in Eastern Asia. And also there are like the Jesuit monasteries and other such places in Europe that held knowledge and that preserved deep culture during times of collapse and chaos, or times when institutions were divided and weak. Well, similarly for today, we need something that works like monasteries, but instead of being a building in the mountains, we need to think of them as the knowledge is held in entire regenerative economies. Now, many of you will recognize this picture of the work we're doing in Bodhidharma to map out a bioregional scale process filled with lots of activities. Imagine how much wisdom is held in reforestation projects, in efforts to recharge the aquifers, in the study of the regional climate and how to change clouds and rain so that we can bring life back to the land, education for children, and so on. There are a lot of pieces that happen at a landscape scale. But the key metaphor here is that the wisdom is held in the network of knowledge and practices across the regenerative economy. If we create regenerative economies in different places, each of them can function like a monastery, holding key knowledge. It might be that they have seed banks of native plants. They might create reforestation guides of native plants and how to grow the ecosystems. It might be other things like teaching permaculture, rainwater harvesting, and so on. But this knowledge is held in the community and distributed across the people so that even if part of the population moves away during an economic collapse, or some of the people die due to a pandemic or an invasion or whatever, the wisdom can be held in a distributed fashion across the region. Another thing is, unlike in the models of civilization that have created so many unsustainable cultures, it's not human beings that are the primary teachers. The land itself is our primary teacher. We go to the land to learn. This design school needs to organize itself around landscapes. Let the land teach you. Go outside when it rains and watch the water run downhill. Walk around and stick your fingers in the ground and see where it's clay, where it's salty, where there are good soils. Let the land teach you how to heal it. And if we do this, then a lot of that wisdom will also be held in the land itself. And this is an important piece of creating a design school for Earth regeneration. Another thing that I really emphasize a lot in the book, The Design Pathway, is that we need to do two things that are very important. One of them is we need to learn how to think, feel, and act as part of the planet, which is what's referred to as Gaia consciousness. But also we need to recognize that humans and the evolution of our cultures have always been deeply entangled in patterns of the Earth system. As you can see in this graph taken from ice core data, that you can track changes in human cultures and the kinds of social organization that were possible, depending on what was happening in the Earth's climate. It was not possible to have widespread agriculture and large-scale societies before the Holocene. Every large-scale, complex human society that has ever existed was in this brief period of warm, stable climate. And the Holocene right now is over. We have ended it. And so we either bring back the stability of the Holocene through some kind of design practice, or we learn how to live and have regenerative cultures in whatever climate comes next. But if we don't understand that our survival and the modes of organization of our societies are deeply connected to the Earth as a whole, then we cannot design for regeneration. So a lot of our work in this design school is about building these capacities and teaching and learning this kind of knowledge. So what are some of the things that would be taught at a design school for Earth regeneration? Well, one thing is all of our projects would need to organize themselves around the principles of living systems. And those principles of living systems would be applied to creating regenerative economies so that we can have economies at the landscape scale. They organize as bioregional economies, but they honor and embody the principles of living systems. So there's a lot to teach and learn about regenerative economics, which is a major theme of discussions in the study group right now, and something that would definitely need to be part of this design school. Also, as we've talked about in previous webinars, the planetary boundaries framework and focusing on these 4 areas is really important. We now have an integration of knowledge from Earth system science that tells us where to focus our regenerative efforts. We need to really focus on reducing the flow of phosphorus and nitrogen that is chemical runoff from industrial agriculture. We need to preserve biodiversity, stabilize and protect ecosystems, because biosphere integrity or the extinction crisis is a major problem. Land system change, which is going from intact ecosystems to various kinds of degraded land, is a major area of focus. And of course, climate change is another major area of focus. And all of these are connected with each other. You can see just by naming them that industrial agriculture, human population growth, and consumer market economies are deeply interwoven into all of these areas. So our design school would need to focus attention on how do we address this specific kind of overshoot identified by the planetary boundaries framework of the Stockholm Resilience Center, while we build these regenerative economies locally, while at the same time developing planetary monitoring of these patterns. We also have frameworks and other projects underway that we can work with. Many of you know that I was working with the Capital Institute last year in their Regenerative Communities Network, and they've designed a framework of interaction for how to activate a bioregional collaborative. So this is a framework that we can use, that we can embody, and that we can teach by partnering with the Regenerative Communities Network and its projects, each project being a bioregional attempt to build an economy that is regenerative. So there's a lot that could be said about this graph. For now, I just want to name that there are various activities, various projects, and various frameworks associated with bioregional design that are already underway and that we could learn from and incorporate into this design school. Another really important area of work is to look at the frameworks that are used for integrated landscape management. Here I give 2 examples of what I consider best in class, exemplars of the best practices. One is the Common Land Foundation, which has developed a framework for working on very large projects. They have a project on the Altiplano of Spain that is 1 million hectares that they're helping to build a regenerative economy. Also, Eco Agriculture Partners, which is a nonprofit organization, works to guide and facilitate multi-stakeholder processes. So this design school could partner with organizations like these, or take frameworks from them or frameworks inspired by them to create our own integrated landscape management processes, including monitoring the improvements of how we learn as all of us try to do this around the world. So there'd be a major focus in this design school on the management of entire landscapes, working with existing projects and creating new ones as we go. Similarly, there's a real need to focus on how to create the conditions for cooperation. Now, in the study group and in previous webinars, we've talked a lot about pro-social. We are actually in the process of creating a research partnership with the pro-social community to be able to bring it into the design practices of the Earth Regenerators study group. Another framework that's talked about in the book and hasn't really been addressed in a webinar yet is called Blue Marble Evaluation, which comes from about 15 years of work in what's called developmental evaluation, which is a way of setting up monitoring and evaluation processes when managing real-world complexity. And so there's a community of people around the world who manage very complex projects, and they've developed frameworks for evaluation that evolve the monitoring while the projects themselves change. And they've now incorporated into this the Blue Marble Evaluation Framework for incorporating Earth system science and things like the planetary boundaries into their work. So here what I'm saying is that this design school would need to incorporate frameworks like these into our work. So for example, how do we create effective groups? How do we create shared vision? And how do we make decisions work effectively so that they feel fair and inclusive? Well, those are things that are explored by pro-social. How do we know if we have the right monitoring system? And how do we know when to change it as the thing we're monitoring changes so much that our earlier monitoring system is no longer adequate? That's what developmental evaluation and Blue Marble can help us do. So here we can see that there are very powerful frameworks with long histories of practice that we can bring into this design school to address issues like these. Also, last year, I put together a compendium, a collection of 42 pedagogical themes for bioregional regeneration, which could become part of this curriculum. And I encourage anyone who'd like to just Google this title, Guiding the Emergence of Humanity's Future, and go read this online. But the important thing here is that these ideas are incorporated into the book that I wrote, and they're also a standalone document right here. So we have a lot of pedagogical elements for thinking of curriculum and thinking of what it would mean to design such a school. And instead of going into all of it here, I'd encourage you to go and read this full 24-page document yourself, which you can read in about an hour. It's pretty quick to read. Another thing that's going to be really important in this design school is to understand the cultural evolution of our planetary crisis. How did we end up with these exponential changes in our social economic systems and in the Earth itself that are driving and dominating so much of what's happening in the world? How did humans become the most powerful driver of planetary change because of the power of our culture? These are things we need to deeply understand, and they would need to be part of this design school. So this is a question that we asked in the webinar on that topic. If behavioral flexibility is the root cause of the Earth's ecological crisis, then how can we design and intentionally evolve cultures using the flexibility of human behavior? For example, we need to understand what creates polarity, conflict, and division if we want to create harmonious and effectively working groups. And this would need to be part of our work. This is about our capacities to cooperate. We need to learn how to cooperate and bring the best research and design tools, the best management practices to our cooperation efforts. And of course, there's a lot to learn about designing our way to higher levels of cooperation. We can learn through biomimicry from insects like these ants, or through single-celled organisms like these sponge molds that are in this petri dish. There's a lot that we can learn about the general principles of living systems and how cooperation evolved in nature to see how to evolve human cooperation in very powerful and effective ways. So imagine this slime mold as being the structure that evolves from the Earth Regenerators study group, where it starts with an online platform in the center, a gathering place of people, but then it links out to islands of connectivity that become deeper, structured, and more powerful as their own bioregional projects. Here we have a visual metaphor of a cooperation process. And there are many other cooperation processes we can learn by studying how it happens in nature. Another thing that I think is really important for creating this design school is to understand that unlike so many other regenerative projects, we would not pick one level, but instead would step back and ask, how do we create coherence and integrate the linkages across all of these scales? How do we connect backyard permaculture to regenerative farms, to eco-villages, to urban sustainability and regional planning, to large-scale ecosystem restoration, reforestation, and all the way up to bioregional scale economies. And then there's the regeneration of continents, and then the entire planet. A major focus of this design school would be how to create coherence across these scales, and then pulling in the subject area focus and expertise of all of the other projects that focus on one or a few of these, but don't have their integration as a focus. And this allows us to have a natural symbiosis with existing programs and projects all over the world. Also, when we talk about cooperation, many of you will be familiar with the Earth Regeneration Fund, which is an idea we started talking about in our study group. And I just want to go through it briefly to show how this relates to the design school. Because a key organizing principle of the Earth Regeneration Fund is to prototype a way of cooperating. So this could become a design project in itself, maybe several design projects. How do we design a portfolio of regenerative projects? How do we learn to function as groups, partner with projects that are regenerating pieces of land, acquire plots of land to regenerate together so that we have a collection of regenerative projects at different scales spread across the same landscape? How do we create the measurement tools for all the flows of value and things that are being done, beneficial outcomes across all of these projects? How do we diversify the risks and manage the benefits of all of these projects? And how do we create platforms of cooperation? If this needs to happen for every bioregion to create portfolios of cooperation, then this becomes a design project that the school itself could learn how to do, both as research and as education, by prototyping these portfolios. And this is something we're already starting to talk about with GIS mapping and territorial planning and integrated landscape management across South America, with a partnership focusing on Barichara and the Santander region, where I live, and also in the Sacred Valley of Peru and in other places spread across the Andes. But imagine having a portfolio design focus at this school that organizes and gathers people together to help all of our bioregions learn how to do this. This seems like a good thing to focus on at a school that shares it in an equal way around the world. Okay, we're talking about a design school for Earth regeneration, which might bring to mind normal mental models of schools. What I want to say right now is that I do not have normal schools and colleges in mind. I'm thinking of something radically different, very different. For example, I don't see this design school being a place for job training to get a corporate job after you graduate from college. This isn't the problem of how students in MBA programs make more money than students in anthropology, where our university is designed as a pathway to join the job market. We're talking about something deeper than that. Also, this design school will not charge fees for admission. It is not a money-making endeavor. It is not a business. It's something deeper than that. It's something older than that. It's also not for credit or to get a degree. You don't go to a design school for regenerating the earth to get a piece of paper telling you that you now know how to design the earth as the earth is collapsing, as the biosphere unravels, and as we enter a mass extinction event. Also, it's not a building or a campus. It's not a human structure that separates you from the rest of the natural world, like almost all of our schools and universities that emerged within civilizations. If it's not these things, then what is it? Well, this design school is about taking the time to reconnect with the rest of nature, to focus inward, to meditate and reflect, to become intimate and familiar with humanity as part of the earth. It's also a sacred place for healing past traumas, for going through the grieving process, for dealing with and managing future traumas, for becoming psychologically resilient, for finding your tribe, for discovering home, for learning who you really are, for becoming sensitive again after you've been numbed by all of the pain of the world. See, this isn't like getting a degree or like job training. This is spiritual work. This is healing work. And it's very important that we recognize this element of Earth regeneration. Also, it's like martial arts training. This is the way to become a guardian, a steward, a protector, a warrior of peace, of healing, and of regeneration. So think of it like going off to the Kung Fu temple to become a servant to society, or the way of Bushido, which is the art of the samurai, to learn how to serve and take care of everyone in your culture. Well, we need ways of building this kind of warrior training, this capacity to stay within paradox, this capacity to serve what's important, even if it's making sacrifices of ourselves, to stay in the pain and the difficulty when it's necessary to do what the earth asks of us and what is necessary for regeneration, to become resilient and internally capable and competent while developing mastery of the body, mastery of the mind, and mastery of regeneration. Also, this design school is about learning to treat all life as sacred, cultivating a deep love for all living things, so that those of us who feel called to become warriors will take a warrior path in service to life. Those of us who choose to become healers will be healers in service to the sanctity of life. Those of us who choose to become parents and elders of communities, to raise children, to honor the culture, to hold continuity of life within our culture, are doing so in service to life. So we can learn indigenous practices, learn about local materials, how to grow them, how to use them, build and retain local knowledge, which would be a key part of this design school as well. And of course, for those of us who choose to have families, learn how to raise our children and how to have regenerative lifestyles. Those of us who choose not to have children still need to live regeneratively. So this design school would also be a place of experimenting, exploring, and prototyping regenerative lifestyles. And of course, we need this design school to connect with the indigenous cultures that still exist. We need to learn from their practices. We need to honor their histories. We need to understand how they feel the sacredness of the land as we learn, those of us who have lost our indigenous roots because empires conquered our people. How do we regain this feeling of the sacred? And how do we partner with and protect and empower the indigenous in places where they are currently doing the regenerative work? And that's going to be an important part of this transition period over the next 50 years. And a good example of this is what's happening in Brazil right now, where indigenous communities are protecting the forest against mining, against deforestation and extraction into the globalized system. Now, as I start to wrap up the presentation, I want to say that we have conversations underway right now to create a design institute for regenerating the earth located in Barichara, where my family is living. So there will be, in the near future, a gathering place for this school. There will be a physical location for those who feel called to come and join it and co-create it. And this is going to open a very interesting question for us. The question for us is, how do we connect local projects like this one, which is just starting in the last week, where we have been invited to talk to the owners of land in the area that you can see here that has been heavily deforested. And we're going to begin water retention and reforestation projects with them. So if we're going to do this local organizing work, how does this local organizing work of a physical location, how does it relate to the global online network that is the Earth Regenerators study group? That's a question we need to explore together for all of us in that study group, which as of this morning had 1,716 people, and it's growing every day. So this is going to be a big group discussion for us. But if you imagine the potential for regeneration in a landscape like this, if you imagine how much we can learn if a design school is structured as the land. So as I've been talking about creating a design school that teaches cultural evolution, cooperation, landscape regeneration, integrated landscape management, how to build a regenerative economy, how to organize at the bioregional scale, to have an area like this where we're beginning to do reforestation, addressing all of these elements in theory and in practice at the same time. A design school with a backyard like this is pretty awesome. So what I want to suggest is that we can create a design school like this in Barichara for people all over the world to come and learn with us. But also, I hope to inspire all of you where you are, if you don't feel like coming to Barichara and joining me in this endeavor, to think exactly the same way about your own backyard. How could you create a design school for Earth regeneration in your own landscape? And that's the question we have to answer using the study group and the ways that we're beginning to facilitate working groups and community facilitators. We're about to start a training for community organizers and facilitators to help us do this together on the online. And also, I want to invite all of you, whenever it's possible to travel again, as COVID runs its course, all who want to come to Barichara and help us with the work here to reach out to me directly, and we can have conversations about doing this. But that's the presentation as I had it. And so what I'd really like to do now is start a discussion. And I want to invite everyone who hasn't done so to use the Ask a Question button to pose any questions you might have. And we can use that space to host and maintain a dialogue together. And so I see right now there's only one question that's been asked by Brian McConnell. So maybe just as you're taking this all in, if you have questions you'd like to ask, pop them into the Ask a Question button and start voting for the questions you'd like to hear addressed. And we can talk about them together. And then we'll use that to structure our conversation for the rest of our time. So while you're starting to think of questions, or maybe you're just soaking this all in, and that's fine too. I'd like to start answering this first question that was asked by Brian McConnell. And as I said, Brian, I'm going to invite you onto the screen. So if you're here, we can have a discussion together. And the question that Brian is asking is, it seems to me the underlying tenet of group selection aligns closely with David Sloan's premise that altruistic groups actually hold an evolutionary edge over thought. He says, I wonder in what ways you might imagine a design school facilitating learning that would help develop this goal. So, super important question. Hey, Brian, how are you? It's nice to see you.
I'm good, Joe. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. I want to start by just inviting you to share a little bit more about your question, because I know you've studied David Sloan Wilson's work, and I'm just curious if you could share with everyone here why you feel David Sloan Wilson's work is important, so that we can give context to the question and then have a little discussion about it.
Yeah, I'm trying to make short work of a response to why Wilson's work is so important in part because it's going against the grain of mainstream science in respect to the viability or even existence of the idea of group selection. So since the mid-60s, mainstream science has effectively contended that group selection is not even real. Um, and right, and I just found, I mean, as an aside, I just found within the last couple of days a conversation between, in a was a documentation of a conversation between Francisco Varela and Otto Scharmer. And towards the end of that conversation, they're actually discussing Varela's model of reflective practice. And Varela,
maybe, Brian, just to keep us on topic, because I think it's so important what you said, and I don't want to lose the strain of it.
Yeah.
Which is, to summarize what Brian was saying for everyone else, there's been a period of time where the idea of the selfish gene, popularized by Richard Dawkins, has been the dominant view in evolution and became a dominant theme aligning with what's called methodological individualism in the social sciences, which is basically reducing all social behavior to individual actions and individual motivations. And what David Sloan Wilson's work has shown, along with many others, is that starting mostly, I think, in the 1980s, they gradually shifted from that focus to very thoroughly discrediting it. And now the mainstream view in evolutionary studies is one of multi-level selection that recognizes there are different levels of social organization in living systems. And this idea of individual selfishness that's still dominant in economics is taught as though it's true today in most business schools in the world, but it's actually been discredited by 40 or 50 years of accumulated knowledge in various sciences. And so I think it's very important for us to understand that the view that David Sloan Wilson has was very much against the mainstream view of biology in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, but sort of accumulated to by the mid 1990s of everything sort of shifted, and now it's recognized that his view was right and the previous mainstream view was inadequate and wrong. So I just wanted to give that context because it's so important to understand this piece.
It is, Joe, and you know, since it kind of came up, I would also contend, because of my familiarity with Wilson's work, particularly in the last year and a half or so, and the interrelationship between the Mind and Life Institute, Wilson's meeting with the Dalai Lama the end of October of this last year, that the role of consciousness, and kind of what I was saying about Varela's insight 20 years ago, was that he seemed to recognize, he makes mention of it in this conversation I just noted, of multi-level selection being somehow, and I think this is the really, really interesting thing, that we're, 20 years later, we may just we may be on the cusp, we may be on the edge of figuring out how consciousness and multi-level selection have a relationship to one another. I think particularly in group work and this dynamic that basically, the question I'm posing to you. So the other part of that framing I'd like to touch upon is 20 years later, I'm currently in the small, and I've been doing small group work now through the Presencing Institute for like the last 5 or 6 years.
Brian, if I may, just because I want to keep us, keep us focused in the discussion of the design school, and I think that where you're going is a very important place for its own focused discussion, and I really want to just name something that is extremely valuable from this as a way of summarizing it, and then allow us to go on to other questions and discussions. And that is that contextual behavioral science, which is one of the pillars on which pro-social is founded, has really demonstrated that the linkage you're describing is true. The linkage between consciousness, mental concepts, semantics and meaning in the mind, and functioning groups. that linkage is very well founded and very well demonstrated. And the other is that there are important tools that we actually have a lot of evidence, a lot of people studying how it works in groups to know how managing groups works. And so as one example, there's a very clear relationship between the effectiveness of groups and shared group identity. And shared group identity is in the realm of consciousness and semantics. But if a person has a personal identity that is felt the same as part of a group identity, then this creates a strong motivational pattern of being pro-social, of being cooperative, altruistic, generous, trusting, and all of those things increase group function. And so that is one way of seeing this connection that I think is really important. And so, so I just really validate what you're saying. It's extremely important, and that's one linkage among many that we could discuss.
Right. Yeah. I kind of where I was going was just to acknowledge Ken Wilber's kind of getting 20 years ago, kind of getting stuck or hammered by his idea of the existence of a mean green meme. And yet I find myself in navigating small group relationships that those respective worldviews, that go with those developmental levels in relation to identity and group identity, kind of being the things that really challenge and a more succinct, a more unified group identity to be altruistic in terms of the balance and the working of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this as kind of the foundational ground of Earth regeneration, because as probably everyone who's attending this webinar has experienced, most of our problems that keep us from solving key ecological challenges are problems associated with interpersonal dynamics. And so there's a real need for understanding how to cultivate these pro-social capacities. It's just extremely important. And as an example here in Barichara, where I showed that image of the reforestation work, there was a place I visited earlier this week that had a natural wellspring that 25 years ago, two neighbors had an argument, they had a border dispute, and one of them brought in a heavy moving equipment, like a big backhoe, and they buried and destroyed that well to keep their neighbor from getting it. And so this intergroup dynamic of conflict and struggle is a foundational challenge for us that we're going to need to work on and deal with. Brian, I want to jump on to some other questions, but I really want to thank you for bringing this up and into the conversation. It's really valuable and very helpful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
All right, talk to you soon, Brian. Take care.
Do well.
Yeah, so this discussion of collective processes is something I think we're going to come back to over and over again. And we've already touched on it quite a few times in the study group. See as right now that the question that I see with the most votes is one from Bill Bowie, which is a good friend of mine. Bill, where's here we go. So Bill, I'm going to invite you onto the screen. Hopefully the tech will allow you to join me. Bill is asking the question, would love to discuss the role of measurement tools in the Earth Regeneration Fund, in particular around measuring bioregional carrying capacity. Well, for those of you who don't know, Bill is actually an expert in context-based measurement as it relates to sustainability. And I'd say, as Bill could tell us if he's able to join us, very knowledgeable about how many of those frameworks are inadequate and what we need to do to get them right. So, hey, Bill, it's great to see you. And I love this question. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I was kind of picking up on it because it was creating some chatter in the sidebar. And so you mentioned it in the framework of the Earth Regeneration Fund. And I think that it would certainly tie into any kind of bioregional learning center. And so, I thought sort of both sharing the work that I've been doing that's heading in that direction, and in particular hearing your feedback, because I know, you address the question of carrying capacity in your book, drawing on the Catton work. So just in a nutshell, what we're starting to incubate is taking a bioregional approach to measuring carrying capacity. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term carrying capacity, it's similar to Kate Raworth's donut thresholds, or the planetary boundary threshold, and the planetary boundary thresholds that Joe mentioned earlier. And essentially creating approaches or frameworks to measure that on a bioregional basis. This has been done already by James Quilligan and the economic democracy advocates in both California and Maine. And what we're thinking about is applying either that and Mark McElroy's multi-capital scorecard, which he has customized to a donut, basically entering the donut categories based on Kate's work. And so that's sort of the measurement side. What we're really developing now is around the sort of what's the engagement process beforehand. So I've actually just spoken with David Sloan Wilson about integrating pro-social in that, in particular because of pro-social's foundation in Eleanor Ostrom's 8 core design principles, as well as talking with the Blue Marble evaluation folks. Glenn and I just spoke this past week, Glenn Page that is, about integrating Blue Marble evaluation on sort of the far end of things. So I guess that's sort of the work as it's evolving, and this is in very much an incubation stage right now. I'd welcome inquiries from others who might want to pilot this. But just hearing from you, Joe, both your sense of that methodology or that framework, as well as how you see this fitting into a bioregional learning center setting.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I know there's a lot behind everything you're saying. So there are, you can go down rabbit holes of the elements. And one thing, just to create a shared context for this conversation right now, is something like the relationship between physics, chemistry, and biology, which is that nothing in biology can happen that violates the principles of chemistry, and nothing can happen in chemistry that violates the principles of physics. And so there's a way of understanding how energy and materials flow in any physical system that creates natural, dynamic, and quantitative constraints. So one of our challenges in these measuring conversations is to have something like an epistemology, a philosophy that recognizes that reality. So I'm already going against mainstream economics by saying this, which pretends we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. But when we start with that foundational piece, one thing that comes out at the bioregional scale is the relationship between information, energy, organization of people, and the flows of materials. So let's put that into a context of something like reforestation, just to sort of make sense of it, because there are lots of directions we can go. But if there's a piece of land that is degraded, it actually will have a limited material flow, because if it rains at all, the rain just runs across the top, increasing erosion and taking away the soils. So there's very little circulation capacity in the land. Similarly, if you have a culture of people where it's all private land and everyone's competing individually to maximize their self-interest, you'd have a similar pattern of degradation. Any flow into that economy would be one that would just cause everything to be extracted and run away and further weaken and limit the system. So one way of thinking about these measurements is to measure the existing capacity. And then there's some kind of growth, like you could increase the capacity with good design. That degraded land could hold and circulate more water if you built water retention systems, put in ground cover, put in a forest, brought more rain in through the connections of the atmospheric components of cloud formation and tree canopy. Now, there are these various linkages that would increase the flow, which is sort of analogous to increasing money supply in a financial system. And I think the key is something like the multi-capital scorecard, which is we need a way of translating between different kinds of capital so that we can track those as exchanges of value. How do I convert human labor into retained water? How does retained water get converted into microorganism activity to fix nitrogen? How does that relate to productive yields in agroforestry systems? And we start to build these monitoring patterns and measurements around those processes.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take something like a watershed as the way we organize our bioregion, then we'll have a container for it. So we could do what they've done in blockchain and holochain, which is create a ledger system, actually do bookkeeping and accounting. And then all the data tracking is there. And so I think like putting these pieces together, as I know you've done in the Sustainable Finance Blueprint that's just come out for public commentary, is to build these as prototype systems. Right now we need to build prototypes of them to guide the learning process for cooperation. Sort of set up cooperation for the measurement, and then use the measurement system to improve our cooperation, investing in what's working.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head in terms of prototyping the not just the measurement methodology, but the cooperation methodology. Increasingly when I'm talking with folks, they're pointing out that the collaboration before you do the measurement is key to creating the relationships for accessing data, for example, and in fact that the data can be crowdsourced. That in many times that people who are impacted most, who quote unquote own the data. And the other thing that came up in this, this is a mouthful, but the Transformation Systems Mapping and Analysis Working Group. We have a work stream on indicators, scorecards, and dashboards. We just agreed to that name. That took a little while to do that. But the idea of baselining. So one of the things that you said is you need to measure the baselines so that you can know where progress is, was one of the key elements that came out of that conversation. So I appreciate you highlighting that. I guess not wanting to respect other folks. I guess just one final thing to note here is just the tie-in to the R3.0 educational transformation blueprint that we're working with you, Joe, on, and Annalise Smitsmans. But we're gonna be launching that in September, and so covering this notion of bioregional learning centers is certainly one of the key things that we'd like to do, and would love to sort of harvest some of the wisdom that you've been, and knowledge you've been generating here as part of that process.
Well, thank you. And one thing to say about benchmarking that's really powerful is to use something like GIS mapping to basically do territorial mapping and create a standardized way of initiating the mapping process. So the specific things that get mapped might vary from place to place. But if different bioregions are each doing GIS mapping, then we can actually transfer learning from one region to another by teaching people how to do that mapping process. And so there's a lot of baseline learning as well as baseline measuring that can be done in a joint fashion.
That's great. And last thing, the multi-capital scorecard that I mentioned, Mark McElroy has developed specific measurement methodologies using GIS tracking. So in particular, the water metrics that he's applied in various different settings are predicated on GIS mapping tools. So
yeah, it's really powerful stuff.
Cool.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Great to have you here.
Yeah.
And thanks for this lovely discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thanks for hosting this. Great stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. Onward we go. This discussion of measurements turns out to be really important. And when you start getting into, there's so many pieces about this that are deeply relevant. And so, moving on to the next question, because wow, there are a lot of questions that have come in, which is beautiful. For some reason, my software is not reorganizing them around the ones that have the most votes. That's why I'm sort of jumping around a little bit. I see the next top voted question that I see is from Armando. So Armando, if you're there, I'll invite you onto the screen. And Armando is asking, or saying, I just finished a 4-part video series called Course Correction with Movement Generation. It's also advocating bioregionalism. And given that many of these communities are in urban areas, is the vision for urban communities different? Do you perceive limitations for urban areas? Armando, I hope you're able to join me to discuss this question because I actually have a controversial opinion on it. And I'd like to have a conversation to broaden beyond my own opinion, but also to share what my view is. Hey, welcome, Armando. How are you?
Hey, sorry, my camera isn't working, but I'm here with you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. This question of urban regeneration is a really important one. And one of the things that I often say is sort of as a provocation, sort of a challenge to people, is that we have no evidence that there's ever been a city before the Holocene. And now that the Holocene is over, we don't really know that there will be cities in the future. And I don't mean to say that as in there can't be, but just to get us to recognize their assumptions about them continuing so that we think really deeply. And I think it's a really important question since the majority of humanity now lives in cities. And I'd love to hear some of your thinking about this. You know, what motivated you with this question? What are you getting at? What would you like to know? And let's have a conversation about it.
One part of it is I just finished a 4-part series with movement generation called Course Correction, and there was like 700 people on the calls, and a lot of them are frontline activists. And because of the history in the United States, a lot of communities of color in urban areas put next to industrial areas. So I think the question of like, are people of color who have been urbanized going to survive? It's a really important one. And movement generation itself is advocating for bioregionalism and bioregional governance. And everyone on the call seemed to be about that. And I just wrote a resolution for my mother calling for bioregional governance in the Bay Area. So just like a big open-ended question around like, can massive urban areas make a shift to like bioregional, planet-based, ecological ceiling or organizations, orientations. And I'm aware though that the frontline activist community is actually calling for that right now. And so there's a lot of alignment in what you're advocating here.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this question or this topic that I think are really relevant to creating a design school. One of them is a challenge articulated by Peter Berg, who lived in San Francisco until he died and was a major advocate of bioregionalism. He challenged people back in the early 1970s by saying that we did not know the carrying capacity of different bioregions, which is basically what Bill was just saying a moment ago. We still do not have measurement frameworks for what the carrying capacities are of bioregions. So there's a huge need for that. If we're going to create a design school for Earth regeneration, this should be an area of focus. And another thing is that as we learn what the carrying capacities are of different bioregions, I think that's where we'll see which cities can continue to exist. So like in the Bay Area, where there's been a continuing human presence for 14,000 years or longer, there's probably good reason to think a city could be there with the Sacramento River coming in and a lot of extended area of trade that it could engage in. But other areas may not be able to continue to exist as a city because of specific features of their landscape. And so it's a really important question to answer in each bioregion. So I think doing this as a bioregional design, like a research program to create this for each bioregion is super important. And that's without touching on the racial justice element that you named, which maybe we should shift to now because that's also really important. But I'd like to give you a chance to respond first.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I was thinking about this resolution for Berkeley, I was aware of the Global Footprint Project's work on carrying capacity. And I just think my first response to that is I feel like there isn't enough people defining carrying capacities for bioregions. So maybe that's one skill set and like just work line that needs to be built out further. But I agree that the carrying capacity does need to get defined for that question to be answered. And without that information, the details of that, it's kind of hard to move forward. Yeah, that's just my, I agree, basically.
Yeah.
Level response.
Yeah. And another thing that I think is really important related to cooperation is that during times of chronic stress, the ability to manipulate a population with propaganda and misinformation and militarism, yes, I'm talking about the United States right now. If we look at what's happening in Portland, Oregon this week, is a really big challenge to the ability to create bioregional governance. And so the fact that colonialism has shifted conquered and enslaved peoples to the most degraded places, the most toxic places, like industrial dump sites is where all the African Americans are in a lot of US cities. That's not by accident. As terrible as it is, that was completely intentional that they did that. And so now we have this context of spatial segregation, historical oppression and violence, and the need for cooperation. And so I think these truth and reconciliation, atonement, and reclamation conversations are a big opportunity for creating bioregional governance in the heart of racial injustice. You go to the heart of racial injustice and explore this history as a way of creating the context for this governance conversation. Otherwise, it's so easy to ignite tensions along the boundaries created by the previous conquerors through propaganda, that they would undermine the ability to cooperate. So this is like really, really important stuff. And I just wanted to give it proper credit because there's so much work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, I just wanted to finally offer just one reflection on that. I haven't verified this for myself, but I've been seeing headlines just on my social media feed that people of color as a whole care more about the environment than white people in the United States, which I've been finding pretty interesting. And there is a very strong through line, like the people who are doing the authoritarian manipulation strategies are the people who are protecting the colonial paradigm and the fruits of that colonial paradigm. And so I think it's really critical that I guess morally we all take the position that as many people survive as possible, and then strategically people of color who have demonstrated that because they're most impacted are, the demand is that the frontline activists, frontline people lead this movement. But I think I'm just hearing from this conversation, it seems really important that we actually double down on this demand around bioregional sustainability led by frontline communities, because that's what's going to happen is part of the problem, or the power gap in decision making.
Absolutely. And also there's a really interesting relationship between the ability to collectively govern for something like a watershed or some other geographic boundary, and the ability to have a functioning local economy. So a lot of globalization has been undermining local solidarity in order to come in and extract it to put in the global market. So there's a sort of protectionism of the regional economy is the counterbalance to that, which is how bioregional governance is done, is to create something like a membrane around a regional economy and then decide the terms of trade. So there's a lot of historic examples of regional economies that we can look to see how this has been done successfully, and recognize that colonialism and globalization have had some sort of positive attributes that have emerged as part of them as whole systems, but they've largely been driven by this very pernicious and very violent and terrible history. And so we need to understand that also in this reclamation of our own histories, as everyone who's in a civilization comes from a conquered people, because ancestrally all humans were indigenous before civilizations. So if I'm not part of an indigenous group now, that means my ancestors were conquered. And so it's a really interesting relationship to our own, as Brian was saying earlier, the consciousness aspect of our identity is a really important space of regeneration.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Just a plug to Movement Generation. Everyone here can check it out. You can check it out, Joe. I think they're very aligned and they're very active, so could be powerful allies.
Thank you. Yeah. And if you haven't done so yet, drop a link for them into the chat box for everyone else. We appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Armando. Yeah, this is actually going to be one of those things that I think will keep coming back for us, which is how do we manage the patterns of history that have created structural inequalities today that we need to be able to deal with as we're moving into the future, trying to do this regenerative work. So I see the top voted question at the moment is from David. So I'll invite David onto the screen. David is now asking, says there seems to be a lot of information about landscape function and pro-social behaviors. How might we balance people's interests that don't yet have a physical space to work with those who have landscape that need caring hands? Do we actively distribute or the formalized works? Do we work to reimagine the wisdom? So he's basically asking a question here, as I understand it, and David, if you're able to come in, you can correct this, of the knowledge sharing and the land sharing for this regenerative work. Is that what you're thinking of, or is it something else?
You got half of it. I wasn't exactly hitting up the land sharing portion just yet. I was more curious about, there is a lot of knowledge out there. Most of it's contained in books, and maybe it's digitally available as well. And if this design school, because I'm a bit fixated on how might we actually create a legitimate enshrined design school that sort of has its feet in the ground at its own home. What would it look like to share the information that is already available? I.e., I've got the Blue Marbles evaluation book sitting over there, but can I share that in a copied form, in a replicated form, without permission? And what does that look like as we try and create knowledge banks all around the world? Which I know that you referenced in some of the articles that you posted about before this webinar, that you're actively creating a knowledge bank. And what does it look like for someone else to say, hey, can I have a digital form of that so that I can then, I don't know, print it out when we have all these copyright laws that are currently enshrined?
Yeah, this is a big question. And one thing I've done is I created, I don't know why we have a feedback problem here. I'm not sure why.
Oh, sorry, I'll mute myself.
Okay, yeah. There, let's try that and see if that works. One thing that I've chosen to do about 2 years ago is I started a physical library. So I now have about 1,000 books in cultural evolution. They're sitting in boxes in Costa Rica at the moment because it's hard for me to move them to Colombia. And I'm about to have a conversation with another friend who I think is on this call, Roberta Werdinger, who's also interested in creating a physical library. And a couple of years ago, I wrote an essay about the biggest threat to science, which is not just about the repository of published papers, but the hands-on, like tacit knowledge of something like, doing glasswork to make the implements of a chemistry lab, or how to do splicing where you actually have people that learn physical skills and laboratory infrastructure that's a key part of scientific knowledge. And what happens if that all collapses with the global economy. And one thing I think is really important is to have actual monasteries, like physical places that are storehouses of knowledge, that people can make a mecca to if the internet goes down and things go really bad. Like I think there's a place like that. There's a role for that piece. But the most important thing is to embody the knowledge in human beings, which is basically to create a lot of teachers and a lot of practitioners. All the practitioners can then become teachers. And as much as possible, distribute the knowledge across human beings so the replication of the knowledge is in those people teaching other people. Like how permaculture has books, but much better than books is a global network of permaculture camps with thousands of teachers. And then the books are great, but even if you don't have the books, a good permaculture teacher is better than the book anyway. And so I think some blend of these two is what's needed. And during the interim time, when we have things like the Mighty Networks cell phone app, then we share YouTube videos and other digital formats of information. And hopefully we'll continue to be able to do that. But we just don't know 20 years from now if that'll be possible. So I sort of think a blended strategy is the way to go. But the most powerful thing is embodied in the human beings, distributed as practices. Because that's the one that's the hardest to lose.
Yeah.
Even though it's a lot of work to cultivate.
What I'm hearing you saying is, so being in Australia, the discussion of the oral tradition that the Indigenous people had here is well known. And what I'm hearing you say is is basically we need to reinstate that, and then have a discussion in the story about the very fact of what that is doing, so that there's an understanding that the knowledge is held in a relationship or context which could fall apart at any moment. Thus, you have to maintain it all the time through practice. And then on the side, maybe we have, resilient manuscripts of some sort that can be there for everyone. I am just curious now, at this moment in time, what do you say around just straight sharing, say, digital information without care for something like a copyright law? Do you think that's, do we need to respect that part of the larger system that has brought us to this point?
I think that we need to act like good hackers. And hackers are good in two ways. They have technical knowledge and they have ethics. And so sharing copyrighted information is probably a really good idea in a time of planetary collapse, rather than waiting to get permission or having the money, or only those with money being able to do it. So there's a hacker ethic. The place where this gets more challenging is if the person you are supposedly stealing from is one of your collaborators. And I'll give an example of someone who might even be on this call, which is Judith Schwartz, who shared with me an advanced copy of her book, The Reindeer Dialogue, or The Reindeer Chronicles. And we're talking about how she can share her book with the study group when she has a contract with a publisher. And so she has copyright restrictions. So what I would want to do is position her as a teacher for her to find healthy ways to share the manuscript, or to share sections of the book while teaching, while honoring her role as the author. So the ethics of the hacker includes the ethics of our relationships. And you see this as an example where we're in the in-between space. I'd love to just share digital copies of her book so everyone can read it, but I would be dishonoring the agreement I had with her when she sent me a copy, when I said I wouldn't share it. So I'm not going to share it because I have a relationship with her as the author. And in this in-between space is the beautiful space, because this is where we'll find creative novelty. We may have better ways to share her content than just making a PDF available to our friends, that actually empowers her as the author to be able to do more of what she does. And I'm thinking similarly of, like, I share the videos that Jeff Lawton has put together because they're great, but I also think people should take his courses. So it's like, how do we balance this? It needs to be a group discussion. We need to have a transparent, ethical discussion about it and be good hackers. But at the same time, we should be sharing things that are essential because they're essential to share. So you can see there are going to be missteps that'll definitely happen, where we will do things that cause problems. Judith, you are here, lovely. So you see, like, this is a space of active creativity. We need to be sort of like social permaculture designers of hacking spaces, which is a beautiful design challenge for all of us. So yeah, let's keep talking about this.
Thanks very much, Joe. That's all I've got right now. So that was awesome.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, David. And what I want to do really quickly is just, oh, funny, I'm having this weird thing that my computer, I try to tell it to start answering the question and stop answering the question, so that I'll have a marker people can go back to see the answer. For some reason, it's not doing it. So that's okay. I want to quickly go on to the next question from Anna, which is here. This question is, if the design school is not reliant on tuition, is there a thought to incorporate some sort of informal exchange in the spirit of the sharing economy? And the answer is yes, and we should talk about it. So I'm on the screen, but I'm not sure if you got the invitation. I'll send it again just in case there was a little glitch. What I see for the answer to this question, how do we create a design school that's not reliant on intuition? Or I'm sorry, on tuition, on basically people paying fees. And one of the things I think is really important is for us to create regenerative economic models. We need to actually practice what we're preaching and figure this stuff out. But I want to hear your thoughts, because I have a strange feeling you're living some of this, having just finished some schooling and being in the in-between space. Like, what are you thinking about here?
Yeah, that's right. I've just, for those who don't know, I've just moved home after finishing my master's abroad, and with the virus, kind of doing all of my learning now online, and that's great. I'm super happy to have that access and all that knowledge, even whether that's knowledge that's in books or through teachers. It's still not quite the same as having that kind of class in person. So I'm really curious how you've been envisioning, even if it's a little bit the cart before the horse, the logistics of getting people down in Barichara to learn firsthand some of these things in person.
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about this is something I learned from martial arts, which is that when there's a martial arts student who becomes a true master, their mastery attracts students. And so the saying is that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So there are people who seek to be students of a martial art. And when they find their teacher, the teacher appears in their life, then they are a student of martial arts. And the teacher doesn't declare themselves the teacher. It's that they are actually a master in such a way that the student, in a sense, makes them responsible to teach. And I think this reversal of the relationship is really important. And a great example of this is Penny Livingston, who's a pretty well-known permaculture teacher. She's out of practice for more than 30 years, that she only goes where she's invited. She's never done a day of marketing. And she's now coordinating the education of people across the Sacred Valley of Peru to do regeneration at this like watershed scale. She's doing absolutely beautiful work. And it's because she's a real teacher and the students seek her. And so I think this sort of ethic is really important. So now thinking of how does that work in some place like Barichara? Well, if I'm actually being a good teacher, people would want to come and learn from me. If I'm trying to sell something and market it and get people to buy it, I may be a good teacher, I may not. Or worse, I may be a good teacher of the wrong thing because it's not what the student actually needs. And you have all these mismatches because we're in such a strange time. And I think the important thing now is we have to figure out how to build these regenerative economies. And the best way to figure that out is to remove money from the equation as much as possible. To just say, if this economy functions without debt-based currencies, then it's more likely to be regenerative than if it's dependent on them. And so someone might have the money to buy an airline ticket to come here, but they wouldn't have money to pay tuition. Well, that's okay. Just get here, we'll figure it out. If I feel like you're only going to be my student because you're paying me, I'm basically going to refuse you access because you didn't pay tuition, then I'm not honoring the student who's seeking the teacher in that martial arts sense. And so what I feel like is those of us who have projects that attract the students will be the ones that get the students. Because right now, the most important missing piece of this education work is people wanting to learn but not knowing where to go to learn. So you're like, should I stay here? Should I go to this place? Should I go to that place? And so the projects should actually be our teacher. This is what I said, the land is our teacher.
That's interesting.
Do it.
Right, yeah. Like the fact that a lot of people seek out an education because they think that's what they need to be doing. They want that mark on, their resume, or they don't really know the intricate details of what they will be learning, but they have an idea of like, that's more or less the direction I need to go. But if in this way you're seeking out the teacher because you want to, genuinely want to learn from them, then I suppose that teacher or this person who has something to teach, you can put it that way, their knowledge speaks for itself, and so that shouldn't need marketing. But then at the same time, there's a lot of people who, like myself, are like not really sure what that direction is, but I know kind of what the first step is. And I know for myself, I'm asking like, where do I want to be physically to be learning about these things, as well as who do I want to surround myself with. And one of the biggest kind of learning experiences I've had in an informal way, I would say, is through the woofing program, which has its ups and downs. But for me, it was very beneficial because it was a way for me to, all I knew is I wanted to go to the south of Italy and eat food and grow food. there, and that's all I knew. But I knew that that was important to me because there's a, you know, a special food culture there, and by living in it, and I was right. I just kind of listened to that intuition. I was right, and I went there, and I've developed a certain kind of love and understanding for food culture that I, even growing up in Seattle in a very diverse and what would be considered progressive food culture, you're still not going to be getting the same thing that you would in the south of Italy. There's just no way. And so I had that experience through woofing, but I was giving my labor in exchange for, you know, food, room and board, but also learning Italian, and also, you know, learning about different permacultural methods, because that was the farm I was on. And I really enjoyed that exchange because I think it's important to be empowered in the learning, knowing that I'm giving something in return. Because if I'm not, then if I'm not 100%, you know, I guess I would question it a little bit personally, if I'm not feeling like there's an exchange happening.
Yeah, this is also something related to martial arts, is that a lot of martial artists did not have very luxurious lives. So like the Chojun Miyagi, who developed Goju-Ryu Karate in Okinawa, became of this highly respected and venerated person. But that was after having like a generation of students and then a generation of students after that. But in the early days, he just had a very simple life devoting himself to his art, which means in a material sense, his life was pretty difficult. He spent 6 or 8 hours a day training in martial arts and probably working some labor job, you know, cooking in a restaurant or working on the docks at a fishery or something. And so it's really important that the students would bring gifts to the teacher. So the students might bring food. Students might come and bring food for the teachers, and the teacher would have food to eat. And this is just an ancestral way of doing gift economy. And what I see that's really interesting now is our biggest asset for this work comes in 2 parts. One part is human capacity to creatively do things. And the other one is degraded land that needs to be regenerated. You put those 2 together and you can create circulations of value. So if someone comes to learn regeneration here, the region is going to benefit from their thinking and their labor, which the region doesn't have to pay for. But that person should also not pay to get that education because they're bringing their thinking and their labor. So that's why we have to figure out these regenerative exchanges, which is very much like woofing. And so I think that's a good model for us to think with.
Yeah, as long as the terms are kind of agreed upon ahead of time and understood. And I think that the woofing model does work in these cases.
Yeah, this is where pro-social becomes useful, because you could actually have a pro-social process for each person who's coming and say, let's create agreements. Let's function as a group together. You know, what kind of shared identity and purpose do we have? What do you need to get out of this? What do I need to get out of this? What are our expectations? And then we manage that. So it's sort of like a contract in a way,
yeah.
But it's mostly about not having the wrong contract. Like, I give you money, you give me the degree and some amount of learning I'm going to get. Instead, it's a different kind of agreement. But learning would still be happening either way. Yeah, so does that answer your question?
It does. I think there's, you know, so much to develop before actually getting into the logistics of what that would look like. But that definitely helped me understand where your thinking lies at this moment.
Yeah, and a lot of this is going to be prototyping. So we'll figure it out case by case until we have something that makes sense as a system. And then we'll use that. But until then, case by case.
I'm happy to be a guinea pig if that's needed.
Come on down. We have really good arepas there.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Joe. Thanks.
Yeah, it's such an important question of, you know, what does this feel like in reality, in practice? So important. I want to just throw out a quick poll to just check how we're doing, because we've been going for about an hour and a half. And I just want to ask, should we go the full 2 hours? Getting full wrap up sooner. And this will allow us to, if everyone can just quickly answer this poll I dropped down here. give me a sense of how long we should keep going, if we should continue the whole time, or if we should wrap up sooner. And while people are voting for this, I'll go ahead and bring in the next question, which is from Galen. Although Galen, for some reason, it's not showing me the ability to invite you onto the screen. So I don't know if there's something with your tech or if you've had to leave. So I'll go ahead and just start answering Galen's question, wishing he could come in and chat with us. Galen has asked, how can we move towards better utilizing tech tools to organize ourselves in novel ways? So I'm imagining this design school participating in the platform co-op movement and connecting with mutual aid groups and the solidarity economy movement. And I would say, Galen, you're imagining exactly what I'm imagining. What I see is the most important role of technology, of the digital communications infrastructure, is our ability to create cooperation across regions and our ability to share knowledge, as we're doing right now in this webinar. I see this kind of ability as being the essential role of tech. And then also what we talked about with GIS mapping and the building of the multiple capital kind of frameworks of value creation, what Bill and I talked about a few minutes ago. I see these kinds of things as being some of the most important tech. But there's another kind of tech tool that I know Galen is aware of, because Galen's an old friend, but it is not the kind of default stereotype of technology, which is that all knowledge that can be applied to solve problems is potentially a technology. So one of our technologies is the knowledge of social emotions, the knowledge of how to be in groups, the knowledge of how to get along with each other, the knowledge of how to manage conflicts, the knowledge of how to be honest and tell the truth, even when we're uncomfortable or embarrassed. Aspects of human development. Yeah, Galen, I don't know why it's not giving me the option either. Sorry, because I really wish you could jump in here. The button is just not appearing for me to invite you. I don't know if it's a software incompatibility or what. But I'll do this on your behalf. Ah, there. That was for the technology gods. But I wish I could see your face, Galen. I miss you. But I think these social technologies are as important as the digital infrastructure. That is also really important. And then there's the technology piece around data systems, like putting up, a watershed monitoring system, using drones and LiDAR, satellite remote sensing instruments. There's a whole realm of technology that's just huge that's related to tech. And so I just wanted to name those pieces and say, all of them are really important. And I think our challenge in creating collaboration is, how do we design the school together and co-create these solutions, which I think is really true, really, really important. So thank you for this lovely question, Galen. And I just want to see, looks like most people want to keep going. A few are starting to get a little tired from everything, because this is a lot of material. So how about if I do a mixture by saying, we'll continue, but let's just take a moment, do a quick breath. Maybe let's do 3 deep breaths together, and then we'll go to the next question. Okay, so deep breath number 1. Are you ready? Breathe in. Breathe out, gratitude for all the wonderful people here today. Okay, breathe in. Breathe out, presence. I'm here in this moment, breathing. And 3, breathe in. And breathe out. I'm ready to go just a little bit longer. So there, we've had a momentary pause before we continue, for those of you who are getting a little overwhelmed. And as my wife can attest, I'm something like a fire hose of information. So I know that this is something that I've been guilty of before. Let's go on to the next question, shall we? I see this great question by Stephanie that I want to invite. So Stephanie, I'm going to invite you onto the screen if you're available. And Stephanie is asking, can the design school inform homeschooling? Any examples or advice to get something rolling by September? Ooh, that's right, because Stephanie doesn't want to send her kids back to school, which is great. So Stephanie, I hope you're able to join me so we can talk about this. Let's riff a little bit as parents together. I really hope the technology works for you to join me. And one thing I'd say about homeschooling, and I think Stephanie has actually posted comments about this in the study group. Stephanie or may have been Sarah Woodrow, I don't remember now, but that homeschooling's biggest problem is that it's focused on individual families. So homeschooling together in a community with other families, which some homeschooling does, is an important piece of the answer. So we need to find families to homeschool together with as a big piece of how we do this work. So Stephanie, I'm not sure if you're able to join me or not. It's not showing you arriving, but it's not showing me that you're not able to come. So hopefully you'll join me in a moment. But in the meantime, this also gives us a little more pause for those who needed it. I want to share that this question of homeschooling is interesting because there are two major concepts of homeschooling that are relevant to regeneration. One of them is unlearning, which is how we take all the things we were taught that actually bring us in the wrong direction, that put us into extractive cultures. We have to unlearn those things. And a lot of the focus of homeschooling and regenerative education needs to be about unlearning. And then another one is de-schooling, which is how we learn how to learn outside of the ways we normally think of education. There's a kind of unlearning in its own right. But, oh, Stephanie, you came and then it went. Oh, I hope you're able to come back. I don't know what happened there. Oh, there you are. Hi, how are you? Welcome. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, is there an echo?
Yeah, there's a little one. Yeah, a little bit, but let's try and work with it and just keep it brief because I'd like to hear your thoughts before technology gets in our way.
Okay, I have an 8-year-old and talking with her parents about school next year, and maybe we can just start a regenerative.
Yeah, that echoes pretty bad, isn't it? So you have an 8-year-old and you're talking with your 8-year-old about going to school, and like, is it a collaboration with your child?
Yeah, she wants to invent her own. That's great. But this is the moment, right? In the U.S. If we're being forced to shift. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll just share a couple of thoughts quickly and say I wish that microphone problem wasn't annoying us, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. One thing that I'd say is that the challenge we have faced as parents was that we had to socially isolate our child for a period of time by not knowing where we would find community. So we spent a year in Costa Rica where we did find one other family with a child about the same age as Elise and built a friendship, but we only saw them about once a week. So our daughter spent a year without other kids, which was really rough. But now, having taken the time to find, to really search and say, my wife creates a list of, this is what education needs to be like, and it's a pretty, deep and philosophical, like a thoughtful list, that when we did find a place, it's amazing what we're doing now. And so if there's a way for you to connect with other families and other kids, and really a lesson we're learning here in Barichara, and our friends Felipe and Alejandra that created the forest school here have been teaching us this, is they're looking at all of the regeneration of the territory is led by the children. And so if you take the children onto a landscape and just let them be in an environment of practicing deep ecology, the children very quickly become teachers. Because the children have not already unlearned very natural human things. And there is a shaping of the ethics and a role modeling for the adults, and the adults shouldn't all be standing around looking at their phones or something. There are things the adults shouldn't do to get in the way of it. So the parents are teaching, but it's also a different philosophy. And I think one of the really important things is to ask yourself, are you and your family going to really try to live bioregionally? And what does that mean for you? Like, are you going to start fermenting and doing food preservation? Are you farming or gardening and growing your own food? Now, there are questions like that that become part of the schooling you would do. And I think that's really important. And then there's also the part about how do the children become the role models of ethics? How do you give the children an environment where they learn to be ethical leaders? Because a lot of what the adults need to learn will come from the kids. And we definitely see that here in our interactions with families, is how much the children impact the adults when the children have good ethics. And so, so I just want to invite those pieces that have turned out to be quite profound for us, but they weren't really obvious when we started. But I don't know if that's helpful or not. So maybe tell me if that's helpful, and we'll see if that's a good place to maybe wrap up, since technology is not working with us. Are you still there, Stephanie? You're muted. I'll unmute you and we'll see. Yeah, was that helpful? I hope that's helpful. I'm gonna go ahead and close your video and just say thank you so much, because this question's important. And let's try to have a conversation in the study group, in the regenerative parenting support group, because it's just a topic that needs to continue. And I know there is a discussion there that's happening. Let's continue on to do, how about if we just do maybe one more question and then we'll start a wrap up. And I see there's a question from, I don't know if it's Asin or Asin. So you can correct me when you come on the screen if you're here, of how to pronounce your name. But you've asked this great question, which is, when thinking in regenerative directions, I'm wondering how we adapt the fading old structures, the hierarchical and patriarchal structures. So municipalities, the state, and so on. And so in saying, I have the feeling that borders are too imaginary to represent something now, but others might stick to the mainstream. We have all these laws that exist. How do we invite the fading structures to share the lessons and not insisting they should continue working? I think there's this really delicate dance that's here. And Asin, if you're able to join me, we can have a conversation around it. But I think this is a dance of death. For me, this is a hospice question, because there are a lot of structures that were built up around things like private land ownership and extractive economies. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the tech. I'll see if I can send the invite one more time and maybe it'll work, or no, it's not giving me the option. Sorry, people sometimes have problems with their web browser, and I'm not sure if that's what's going on. But Crowdcast has had this problem in other calls, and I think that may be what the problem is. But let me just continue with this briefly to keep us on focus for wrapping up, which is that I see this as being like if you are at the deathbed of a loved one, like your mother is dying or your grandfather is dying. How do you let the old structures go while welcoming the new? And one thing is you honor their dying process. Another is to see what is actually adaptive in the current context and what isn't, which means you have to get really good at discerning what's really going on. And then there are all these hacks, these things we can do where the existing structures don't help us, but they don't get in our way if we do something that's outside the bounds of how they're structured. So like an example of this is a conversation I was having with a friend of mine, Cassandra Ferreira, and a few of her collaborators around creating sacred contracts for real estate agreements, where sacred contracts are about your relationship to the land. They're not about the legal framework itself, but they're related to the legal framework in interesting ways. So if you start with a sacred contract, what you're doing is building a sacred feelings and sacred relationship to the oldest tree on your land, to the source of water as it's coming across your land, or something like this. And this has no connection to the legal boundaries. It's just a relationship to a piece of the land. But once you build this semantic space, this place of consciousness, you interact with all the legal structures differently. And so I think that this way of working with, not working against, and transcending these structures is about finding relationships outside of them and then coming back and asking how to work with them. And that this is something a lot of us will be asking over and over again, because so many of the structures we have right now evolved in a context that is not the context we need for the future. So they're structured inappropriately for where we're going. And a lot of them are going to get in our way. And I also have a lot of examples where a system has to collapse before regeneration can occur. And it might be the case for municipalities, for example, that the economy has to collapse, which happened here in Bhatichara with the COVID virus. They locked down the economy, and within 1 week, 80% of the economy disappeared because the economy was based on tourism. And so this thing about the collapse of the economy is why we're able to talk about reforestation in that region of the landscape, which wasn't really happening before. So the collapse happened before the regeneration could occur. And I think that's going to be the case in a lot of places. So you can see how hospice and death are a part of the process. But this is a really difficult question, and the local context is going to be where you look for your answers in each case. So I think in terms of looking at this as a design school, the design school would be about how do we learn the lessons from place to place about how to do this, and how do we teach them to each other, which I think is a really important part of this. So thanks for the question. I'm sorry you weren't able to join. What I want to start doing now, just to kind of honor the fact that several people are feeling overwhelmed and are ready to stop. And a few people have already started dropping off the call because they had other obligations and things they needed to do. So I just want to end this call now by not answering any more of the questions, and instead say, what I hoped to accomplish today was to share my vision for a design school for Earth regeneration, and that I really do believe this is possible to do. And the other thing is that I'm going to try to build a bridge between the online organizing and capacity of Earth Regenerators as a distributed network and my own kind of focused work, my family's focused work here locally in Colombia, where we have things to do in the land that will take a lot of our time. And so what I really want to do is create a design school here that people can physically come to. Like when Anna and I were talking about how that's like woofing, how someone may come here to participate in that. And that when the opportunity is open for people to travel again, I would like for those who feel called to find their way here to come and work with us. But at the same time, we have this online community and this need to create bioregional economies in many places. So I don't want everyone to come here. That would be way too centralized. So we need to find the balance between these things. And so as we think about how to facilitate and manage Earth Regenerators as a cooperative, instead of as Joe's study group, as we cultivate leadership and distribute ownership of that community among the members, that we will start to have capacities to do that online work. And then I will be freed up to do more focused work here locally while also participating in the global network. And I think a lot of people are in this question of how much to be online and how much to be in their own landscape. So this is a question for many of us. And so what I really hope to do is to cultivate this capacity. And I see David has just asked the question, have we contacted those interested in being facilitators? And the answer is partially yes and partially no. Diego Gali and I sent out a survey for people about what this training should be about, but we're about to officially invite people to apply. So it's just about to start in the next couple of weeks. So look for it in the study group and come and help us co-create it. And for those of you who are thinking about coming to Bhatichara, just hold it, meditate on it, think seriously, and then talk to me. And know that in any context, there's politics and sensitive aspects and histories to deal with. Same is true here with 500 years of colonialism in this place where we're living now. But at the same time, there's this need to create a design school for Earth regeneration that, as David was saying, it needs to have physical locations. And I think we need to create a network of these physical locations. And I want to create one of them where I am. I'd also love to create partnerships for people to create them where they are, and then have this online infrastructure to connect all of us. So this is sort of, you can see the pieces moving together. And this is meant to be deeply collaborative and not to overstep what other people are doing, but instead to create the space for us to have nested scales of collaboration all the way to the planetary scale. So with that in mind, I just want to thank you all for being here again, for sharing in this. Afterwards, if you want to share the link to this webinar with anyone, they can come back and watch the replay. Come and share and participate in the study group if you haven't already. And just thank you for being Earth Regenerators. Let's move forward and manifest more of these ideas as real world projects. So thank you all and have a beautiful rest of your Saturday.